Hi all, Trails Unpacked here, and today we're going to tackle one of the biggest questions we get asked about through hiking, and that is how much exactly does it cost to complete a long distance hike? For this video, I'm going to use my PCT hike that I completed in 2024, and I went through everything. I got the receipts and I have the total breakdown of every penny that I spent while on trail. So stay tuned for this video as we break down the different categories and what you can expect to spend on your long distance hike. Okay, so let's get into it. Some of you watching this video are probably watching it to try to figure out how much money you need to save or be prepared to have for a thru hike, which is totally understandable. Saving this amount of money can be a multi-year process. However, I'm here to say the answer isn't always straightforward. Depending on the person, thru hike costs can vary substantially. There can be people who do it as low as $1,000 and people who do it over $10,000. What I'm hoping to do in this video is show you the breakdown of what I spent and give you kind of the caveats and reasons behind my spending so that when you think about your budget, you can kind of think about it in those categories as well, and then either adjust more, less, or the same based on how you think your hiking style is similar to my experience. So on my 2024 PCT thru hike, I spent $6,699.49. This was across 134 days, which does include zeros, which makes my daily cost roughly about $50. I do not include gear purchases that happened pre-trail in this budget, and I also do not include any life costs, such as insurance or phone bills, or things that I would be incurring regardless of whether I was on trail or not. How does this stack up to the average? Halfway Anywhere completes a hiker survey at the end of every hiking season. And for 2024, he recorded the average cost for a completed PCT thru hike at $10,149. So you can see that my cost was substantially lower than this. And we can dive into those categories here. So let's think about the main categories that this breaks into. For the purposes of this video, I broke my spending into these main categories: resupply food, hot food, gear, accommodation, pre and post trail transportation, mail, transportation on trail, and souvenirs. Now, I bet you might be able to guess what my highest cost was. And it was food. So my two food categories that I have here are resupply food and hot food. And you might be asking, what's the difference? Resupply food is food that I bought to eat on trail. This is food that I packaged, I put in my food bag, and I hiked out. Hot food is food that I consumed pretty much on the premises of where it was made. It is hot, it is fresh, it is from town. Sometimes that's a Subway sub, and sometimes it's a whole restaurant meal. My resupply total was $1,930.86. My hot food total was $1,895.37. My next biggest category was gear. That came in at $1,212.64. Accommodation was my fourth category at $810.64. My pre and post trail transportation together equaled $484.75. Mail or postage was $195.49. My on-trail transportation was $100.81. And souvenirs was $50.64. So the reason I broke my resupply and hot food apart was because there's just drastically different costs associated with them. Together, though, these categories amounted for over 60% of my total budget and spending on trail, which just goes to show how much food really will impact. My resupply costs. I never sent myself a resupply package from off trail to trail, meaning that I bought all of my resupply food from trail towns or establishments by trail that you might see in a traditional hike. However, I don't feel like any of those costs were unreasonable. When I look at my daily spending for my resupply food, I had 105 days where a majority of my meals came from resupply. And so that made my resupply cost roughly $18 a day. I am okay with that. I think that that is a normal amount to spend, especially for hiker hunger. And so that does not seem exorbitant to me and does not indicate to me that it would have been cheaper to send myself resupply packages. Now, hot food is where it really adds up. And when I talk about hot food right now, I'm going to group that with accommodation because where I traditionally eat hot food, and most people do, and where you incur the biggest expense of that is town. And I will say that town is the singular biggest expense to completing a thru hike. You might be raising your eyebrows at that. I mean, how many times are you actually staying in town on a full thru hike? But you would be surprised. So let's break it down. I'm going to talk about accommodation first and then bring hot food into it next. So I spent $818 on accommodations for this thru hike, and that is specifically paying for a bed to sleep in. I slept in a bed that I paid for 20 nights out of my thru hike, and my thru hike took 134 days. So at first glance, that number does not seem outrageous. It was my fourth highest category. And so you might be thinking accommodation doesn't seem like that big of a deal. But here's the big caveat. I hiked the entire trail with at least 3 other members the entire time, which means that I split hotel rooms and lodging every single time that I was sleeping in an accommodation. So my cost is actually reflective of a fourth, maybe even a half of what solo hikers incur when it comes to accommodations. Our cheapest hotel stay the whole trail was $60, again split 4 ways, and our most expensive one was $180. So if I think about spending 20 nights in a bed and paying for, let's take the average of those two, $120 for those nights, I'm up to $2,400 in accommodation costs already. So let that sink in. And the thing with accommodation is that when you're staying in town, you're eating in town. So a lot of my town food costs were mainly racked up during 0 days when I was spending time in town. And one example of this was my meals for a 0 day in Bishop, California. Those totaled $110 because it includes 2 dinners the night before and then the night of your 0, 2 breakfasts, the morning of your 0, the morning after your 0, lunch, and then any snacks in between. So that means 1 0 day can easily cost you over $200 between food and 2 nights of accommodation, the night before your 0 and the night of your 0. So if you're really looking to create a strict budget or have a budget to stick to, town stays, 0s, and town food are going to have the biggest singular impact on your costs and your budget. And honestly, something that just isn't factored in, I think, to a lot of pre-trail planning. So now let's talk about gear. You might be wondering, since this does not include my gear costs pre-trail, where does my huge number come from of around $1,200? I will say I had 2 unplanned big gear purchases on the PCT that really bumped up my gear number. The first being $400 for a new pack, and the next being about $160 for a new sleeping pad. Now, it is common for experienced thru hikers or new thru hikers to have to acquire new gear while on trail. Either something breaks, it comes to the natural end of its life, or things just aren't working out like you anticipated. It doesn't matter how many gear reviews you read. Sometimes it just takes doing it to be like, this isn't working for me. And you'd be surprised what money you're willing to spend when you really see what happens and what's standing in the way between you and a good night's sleep. So some things that you really can bank on for gear when you're putting that together is shoes. 5 to 6 pairs of trail runners is the most common number of shoes that are going to be used in a thru hike. And if you kind of know the relative cost of your shoes, typically between $100 and $160, you know already you could have $600 wrapped up in shoes coming out to trail. Other things to think about is a new water filter. That is a very common for people to replace mid-trail. It's about $50. New socks are another big common item. In both of my past through hikes, have replaced my socks at the halfway mark, only because the cushion was coming out. Darn Tough does have a lifetime warranty, though. If you have any holes in it, you can swap those out for free. So that is a budget-friendly way if that does happen to you. And then one thing to remember for the PCT, there is a bear can requirement. So you might incur the cost of renting a bear can while you are on trail, or of having a bear can mailed out to you. So that might just switch the category of where that money is coming from. So the next category that I'm going to dive into is my pre and post trail transportation. This is one of the costs that is pretty inflexible. Plane costs are what plane costs are. And if you live on the other side of the country, there's not much you can do to mitigate for that. So I was flying out to the PCT from the East Coast and back from it. So that is why my costs were close to $500. That was in a flight to San Diego. I did have a friend drive me from San Diego to Campo, so I did not incur the cost of the shuttle, though that shuttle is relatively cheap. And then when I completed the trail, there was a cost of a train and then a flight back from either Vancouver or Seattle. So just something to keep in mind. That is a category that can be very easily overlooked because you're just thinking about plane tickets and not how that factors in to a trail budget. After that is mail and postage. Now, if you listened earlier, you heard me say that I did not send myself any resupply boxes. So you might be saying, hold up, girl, where is this cost coming from? Almost $200 in postage. So while I did not send myself food resupply boxes, I did have gear boxes that I had mailed out to trail and boxes that I also mailed back from trail. So I had my bear can mailed to me on trail twice, once for the Sierra section and one for the Washington section. I also had all of my shoes mailed to me. I bought my shoes ahead of time. I left them with my parents and then had my mom send them in USPS boxes so that I could get them when I needed them most, and then wouldn't have to deal with wondering where they were going to be delivered to. I had a little bit more control over that. And these costs add up quickly. The USPS large flat rate boxes run $25 a box. And that is about, if you're really sending resupply packages, about one of the smallest sizes you could get away with. So if you're planning on sending packages, I would really budget for $20 to $25 a package. And again, you can see how that cost adds up substantially. And one of the reasons why I don't do food resupply boxes. I also mailed things back from trail. So I had cold weather gear that I did not need once I finished the Sierras, and cold weather gear that I did want when I went into Washington. And I don't want to carry that the whole time, so I had that mailed back home. I also just had a natural shakedown, which even after one through hike, shakedowns will continue to happen. So after about 500 miles, I sent a package home with just some stuff that was a little bit extra that I didn't need, but I did not want to get rid of. So always factor that into your budget as well. All right. And last category, transportation. And so what am I talking about when I say transportation? Because we're out here primarily meant to hike. This is transportation from trail to town and then back again. And honestly, sometimes depending on the town, you need transportation around town itself. Now, my transportation cost on trail was pretty low. It was about $100. And when you think about that over the course of 5 months, that's pretty cheap. And the reason for that is that I relied on hitchhiking for 95% of my transportation. If you are not comfortable hitchhiking, if you don't wish to hitchhike, then I would expect a much higher transportation cost in here. Trail angels and shuttles were plentiful on the PCT, but almost all of them cost money. Either they state that cost up front or they ask for a donation. So on the bare minimum side, I would expect $5 a ride. And on the highest side, I would expect $20 to $25 a ride. Sometimes that cost goes down if you split with other hikers, and sometimes it's already per person. So just something to keep in mind that you are out there without a car and there will be transportation costs that arise, especially when getting to towns that are a little bit further away. If you do plan on hitchhiking, then I would say you're pretty much looking at the $100 to $150 mark. Hitchhiking is a phenomenal way of transport that is most of the time free. I do try to ask people if I can pay them gas money if they're going out of their way. I have never been taken up on that offer. A lot of people are just happy to do it. They're going that way and they want to hear your stories. So what's the bottom line? Ultimately, it's hard to apply a singular number to the cost of a thru hike because everyone hikes a thru hike in their own way. The one thing that I can tell you is that the more days that you spend out on trail, the more expensive it is going to be. So when you're thinking about wanting to constrict your budget or how long you intend to be out there, make sure to factor that in. I was out there for 134 days and spent just under $7,000. In the end, remember that there's no wrong way to thru hike. You're out there to enjoy yourself. Hope you found this video helpful.